Yeah, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, as you already said, Richard and myself, we will be talking about modeling player performance after potential transfers between leagues. How much can be explained by athleticism? So we are looking into the physical demands of different leagues and how this translates into the players' success in those leagues. But before I come into that, let me briefly introduce ourselves. So we both work for the same company, which is a European management consultancy. We are specialized on quantitative and technological projects. Most of us have a STEM background. Richard is an engineer. I'm a mathematician. And we are active across many different industries. One of them being sports analytics. That's why we're here. And we are doing several data-driven projects. For instance, in scouting, we build internal scouting platforms within the ecosystem of clubs. We do match analysis, advanced KPIs, and so on, and also bring data-driven decisions to talent development. So we always have like this data mind in our work and try to work closely together with the clubs. We already can name some clubs here which are in Germany, like Schalke, Hoffenheim. Most of you probably know them. We also work in other sports like ice hockey, and of course, Richard is based here in London, so we are happy also to work across the globe, more or less say Europe. But I think that was more than enough of us. Let's go to the topic why we are here. And yeah, many of you probably see the headlines. I think at Intelligence downstairs also mentioned Florian Wirtz this morning. So what's going on wrong for Florian Wirtz? Is he struggling at Liverpool? And also some saying the physical demands and the speed of the game in England are unlike anything he has faced in Germany so far. So we, with the data mind, we ask, is it really true? Can data prove it? Can statistics prove that? So there are a couple of questions that arise. First of all, is the Premier League really the most physical league? Then also, do freshly transferred players struggle? So not only looking at Florian Wirtz, of course, but also looking at other players and check, can one predict if a player is struggling or not, if some players adapt better than others. So that's why we came up with this approach. First of all, every good statistic starts with a hypothesis. Ours is that physicality of players gives prediction power for success in the Premier League. Well, within this research, we got the Hudl data from stats form. The season 24-25, we got the physical tracking data as well as event data for the top 5 leagues. And then process that data. First of all, we grouped that into 5 position groups, being stringers, strikers, wingers, central midfielders, center backs, and fullbacks. Then we filtered out all data points for players who played less than 600 minutes on that position to avoid having too many outliers. So we came up with 30 to 90 players per position per league. And then we threw statistics on that. I will show you on the next slides. And then later we went into the modeling phase, which Richard will talk about. And there we tried first some linear models, some simple models, but then also some more complex models. And finally came up with some predictions for player transfers, which clubs can then use to first of all see which players adapt better if they would be transferred and which would adapt more poorly to a new league, or maybe also like more hypothetical, if you have a player in your, for example, in the Premier League and you wanted to loan to another club, which league should you choose to loan it to, or because either the league is more similar to the Premier League, or maybe the league is more suited for the player, so you raise his selling value. So as I said, first of all, we look at some plots. And here you can see kernel density estimate of sprinting distance for strikers. And what you can clearly see here is, like looking at these 5 leagues, you have quite similar means in the total sprinting distance. 2 curves are more flat than the others, but then one league definitely is shifted a bit and has a higher mean, and that's in this case the Premier League in red. And we could see that in many different categories that the Premier League is indeed most challenging across these 5 leagues. What were the attributes we were looking at? Well, there's lots of attributes in the data set, but using correlations, we came down to these 9 variables, which we used in the further analysis. Some physical attributes, for instance, the high acceleration percentage is the count of high accelerations respect to the count of high and medium accelerations. And for instance, the max speed medium, which also plays a role later, is the median of how fast the player is per match, like his max speed per match, and then the median over that. On the other hand, we also considered 2 other attributes which were quite crucial, one of them being age and the other being league rank, because football is still a team sport, so that's also a big role in our analysis. Well, as I said before, we wanted to prove that physical performance matters. We did not only look at plots, but also look at some formulas. Here, the physical demand index. I don't want to dig too deep into that, but this test showed that there's indeed a significant difference in physical demand between the leagues. Here you can quite nicely see that the legend is from red to green. Red being the Premier League is more challenging, and you can see there are also only red points and some more yellow points, but no green points, because the Premier League is more challenging to every league and also on every position. But of course, that's not always the same. For instance, the fullbacks in the League A have quite a similar profile, whereas the players in the Bundesliga, in this case, have much less physical demand. So this is how we established that the physical distribution indeed is different from different leagues. Then second of all, we also wanted to look at the output. Does physical demand really change how well players are, their success? And for that, you can quite nicely start off with something simple like the age curve here, which shows what you probably all know, that most players are like between 20, 25, and then there are less players when they're getting older, because the physical performance is tougher then. And you also see that it's a bit position different. So for instance, for wingers, they peak more early because the athletic ability is most important for wingers, and center backs can do much more with their tactical experience. Also here, we don't want to dig too deep into that. The findings also agree with common literature that you can see somewhere else. So that's how we established that on the one hand, physical performance matters, but also translates to output, and started the modeling phase, which Richard will tell you about.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so the next question then is kind of how do we measure player performance? I think it's a pretty big question for everyone. And so what we need to do just to kind of ease our calculations and kind of mean that we can have models that were made in time, where we need to pick like kind of single target variables for each position that would signify whether a player was good or not. For strikers, we picked non-penalty expected goals per 90. That's fairly uncontroversial. For wingers, we went for non-set piece passes and dribbles into the penalty area per 90. This metric actually came up earlier in research talks, so that's quite good to see. For central midfielders, fullbacks, and centre-backs, with the time we had, we weren't able to find a single output that kind of quantified whether they were good or not. You can largely explain this, I'd say, by saying, the duties for these positions is a mixture of on-ball or off-ball, so single variable to kind of like highlight that is harder. So now that we had our physical features and we had some target variables, it's time to do the good stuff. So the stats, the analysis, such. So we started off with some linear analysis. I'd say the linear analysis, whilst this was insightful, it didn't kind of produce any applicable measures. I think one bit of insight we saw was, for example, in the Bundesliga, the strikers in the Bundesliga compared to the Premier League are a lot slower. So their relative acceleration and sprint speed is significantly lower. And there was this kind of cluster of Bundesliga player strikers that had quite high XG, who were a lot slower than any Premier League players who would kind of mark as high risk kind of qualitatively. I'd say those, just to name them, there was Patrick Schick, Dennis Undav, and begrudgingly also Harry Kane fell into that category, unfortunately. But yeah, so in conclusion, if there is a relationship between these physical features and output, it's not linear, and probably intuitively we can think these physical features might also be interconnected. So there might be a minimum threshold of acceleration you need to perform in the Premier League, and then once you meet that minimum threshold, you also then, the stronger you are, the better you are. These sorts of relationships. So in order to kind of model this relationship correctly, or appropriately. We tried boosted regression, gradient boosted regression. So this is a kind of machine learning model. It's relatively robust against overfitting for very small data sets, which we had here in this case, 90 observations maximum, 30 as well as 30 in some cases. So at this point, we kind of ran regression models for the 5 leagues for the 2 positions. So basically trained one model for each league and saw what we could find from the results. In terms of for the strikers, the striker population group was a lot smaller than the wingers, so we weren't able to find any models or any results that were significant or usable. But for wingers, we were able to find 3 models that performed quite well: the Premier League, Bundesliga, and La Liga. And actually, when we compared the predicted and the true values for unseen test data on the Premier League, we got a Pearson coefficient of 0.78, which I'd say is suspiciously high, to be honest. And then Bundesliga a bit more sensible at 0.67, and La Liga at 0.56. If you wanted to draw sweeping conclusions on stage in front of people, you would be able to say that this shows that in the Premier League, physicality is a stronger predictor of success than in the other leagues, but of course we shouldn't do that, that would be wise. But in our Premier League model then, what features did the model think were important and which were less important? So we calculated the kind of game-based importance of these features. League rank came up top. I'd say, players' performance for wingers. If you play for Manchester City, you're going to have more opportunities to do well to enter the penalty area. If you play for Ipswich, the opportunities are harder to come by, unfortunately. High acceleration percentage, so this is like a proxy for acceleration, was also quite important, and ground dual win percentage being important. When you compare this to the Bundesliga results, the Bundesliga importance was league rank again was the most important, but then maximum speed was the second most. And if you wanted to kind of fit a narrative around this, it would be along the lines of, in the Premier League, the defenses are more tightly compact, it's harder to find space, so if you have that kind of off-the-line speed to get into the space and the reactions to get there, then you're going to be rewarded, whereas in the Bundesliga, there's a bit more open space to run into, so if you have like that high sprint speed in order to exploit that, you'll be well rewarded there. So that's kind of enough talking about the models, and now we're going to look at some actual projections for players. So what we did was we projected how a player would fare if they moved to a different league, assuming the same league rank. We didn't try and predict kind of the league rank that they would be moving to. And also, I'm going to now describe some narratives that really oversimplify how the model works, but just to kind of paint a bit of a picture for some of these players. The first thing we asked them was, how will the transfers that happened this summer into the Premier League for wingers, how they fare? Yes. So unfortunately, especially for our hosts who signed Chukwueze here, the model does not predict very high output, or it does predict significant decreases. I think just looking into the data after we had these results, I kind of played around to see kind of why this might be. So in Chukwueze's example, his acceleration is really low in the Premier League. Like, of 92 wingers, when he comes in, he's in the bottom 5. There's acceleration. So that's what the model's penalizing him for here. Ryan Cherky and Florian Wirtz, these players in the Ligue 1 and Bundesliga models, they actually outperform their physical attributes. So, there's indication to say that they're actually just more talented than their physical attributes indicate. But our model here is not assuming that will continue. So that's why they're getting the penalization. In terms of Jamie Gittens, he had very high sprint speed for the Bundesliga. He was like in the top 10 in terms of sprint speed in the Bundesliga. His acceleration in the Premier League is not very impressive at all compared to the rest of the population. So that's why he gets his discount. I would then jump to our one positive case, which is Dan Ndoye from Nottingham Forest. Just physically, he's very fast. That's why our model thinks that he's going to do very good, because he's got very high acceleration. If you look at his numbers from Serie A, there's a chance that he's not very good at translating his physical attributes into performance, but we're not here to kind of predict that. So, is it all doom and gloom? But have we just got a model that says when you bring a player into the Premier League, they get worse? Because that wouldn't be very interesting. So no. What we then did was we found players that in the Bundesliga and La Liga were particularly well modeled by those models. So, physicality is a good predictor in those leagues, and so how they would project if they were to move to the Premier League. So in this case, we've got some notable improvements, I would say. The timing can be better for us to say that Vinicius Jr. would do fantastically if he came to the Premier League. We had the handies in 2 weeks ago, so I can guarantee you we haven't doctored that in the last week. But also notably, I think Nico Williams has a substantial increase, and these players are kind of very physical. I'd say Julian Brandt, Weishaupt, they don't have very high acceleration, so that's why they've been penalised. And I'd say from a kind of scouting point, an interesting player here is Abde El Zalzouli, who is a player I wasn't really aware of before, but he's a winger for Betis. And what we're saying with this is that in La Liga, his kind of output is well modelled by his physicality. If he was to be as well modelled in the Premier League, he would still be quite a productive player at kind of 10 passes and dribbles into the penalty area per 90, and he's relatively young, so that could be a kind of low-risk transfer into the Premier League for a mid-table team. But you would also say then, if you're very discerning, that we've kind of almost categorized all of the Bundesliga players will do worse here, and all of the La Liga players will do better. So again, is it a particularly good model if it just says that players moving from Bundesliga to Premier League will be bad? And we assume then if players move from the Premier League to the Bundesliga, they'll be great. So we then tested out players who are well defined in the Premier League and projected how they would work in the Bundesliga. So to Tobias's point on kind of if you want to see which players to loan out and where to loan them. And what you have here is quite a variety of kind of how the model thinks players' performance from the Premier League to the Bundesliga will change. And I think we probably have to defend or try and defend or excuse some of these cases. Like Bernardo Silva would decrease his output significantly if he moves to the Bundesliga. That doesn't feel quite right because he's a very technical player. I would say my opinion of him is he's not very athletic, but what the model is penalising him here for is that he has quite low sprint speed, so the model doesn't like that. And also a lot of his numbers come from the fact that he plays for a good team and has a very good ground duel win percentage. And that ground duel win percentage in the Bundesliga doesn't matter to the same extent. To speculate on why that is, I guess there's probably less pressing nowadays in the Bundesliga than the Premier League. I'm not sure, I don't want to really stand by that statement too much. But what is very interesting as well is that players who have quite high sprint speed like Cody Gakpo and Jack Harrison have received increases. And actually, why I quite like this is it's what this model is trying to show, or what it's suggesting, is that you can take players from the same league, same position in the Premier League and move them into the Bundesliga. And what we're saying is that because of their physical attributes, the input and the performance will change drastically. And so that's kind of what we were hoping to show and predict and kind of what we have. I would also say Omar Mamouche coming off as bad in the Bundesliga is quite embarrassing to the model because obviously he got signed to the Premier League off the back of being fantastic in the Bundesliga. This is modelling him as a winger, and for Frankfurt he was a striker, so maybe we can just say that Frankfurt knew what position to play in the Bundesliga and our model doesn't. But in terms of conclusions, it was a wide-ranging kind of study. We touched on lots of various things, but can't, based on the data set and the time we had, we can't make too many sweeping conclusions. But we would say that the physicality of the Premier League is much harder than the other 5 leagues, and also the extent to which there's a difference in the physicality and physical demands changed on a position-by-position basis. In the Premier League for wingers, for non-set-piece passes and dribbles into the penalty area, we could say athleticism is a reasonable predictor as well, which is quite nice. And so I suppose, when you are considering kind of signing a player, you should consider first, will they still have the same kind of relative advantage? Will they still play for this? Will they still benefit from playing a strong team in that league? It's very hard one to say. Okay, in terms of the relative team strength for the player that they're playing for, when moving from team A to team B, are they going to have the same benefits? So, for example, I would be quite cautious if you're Bournemouth signing a winger from Bayern Munich and expecting him to do as well there as in that. And then also, another condition to think is, will players actually meet the minimum athletic threshold in the league that we're transferring them into? In terms of applications then, Immediate applications, we'd say potentially you could use our winger model for transfers to evaluate transfers between the Bundesliga, the League, and the Premier League. We'd also recommend using physical demand index as part of like a scouting report to kind of highlight more risks. In terms of like advanced applications in the future, we could use our models in order to kind of decompose the difference between why a player is good for physical reasons and why there might be kind of natural skill and talent. And also the physical demand work that we've done could be used to kind of predict or optimize squad planning, so you'd have more coverage in kind of physically demanding positions, and potentially you could have like slightly older, fewer players in like centre back and strike, centre back largely. But yeah, that's kind of. We also have future improvements. So obviously with like more data, more leagues, more seasons, I think we'd also like to include more features into the model. Like we kind of kept it small and simple, just to be able to provide narratives to explain what the models do. But like, with this kind of machine learning process, maybe more is better, definitely. So we'd add more into, and also it'd be nice to kind of model other target variables as well, instead of just the single one that we've done a reposition. We'd also like to investigate kind of how predictive player overperformance of their physical attributes is in the future. And we'd like to identify better performance metrics for fullbacks, centre backs, and central midfielders. And finally, we'd also like a better proxy for team strength, because that did prove out to be quite important when we just use league rank. We'd like to kind of see if there's a better measure out there that could be a bit more robust. Now that's it. Thank you.